Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
Hey everybody, it's Jared. Welcome to another episode of All Things Crime, man. Appreciate you being here. Appreciate all of you listening and watching on YouTube and Rumble. Make sure to hit that bell so you don't ever miss an episode. I am in the Memphis, Tennessee area. While I was out here, I was able to meet up with George Jared, and he is actually one of the most accomplished writers I've ever worked with. And he's also one of the most extensive writers about the West Memphis Three case. When I first heard about the West Memphis Three, I always thought it referred to the three boys, the three young 8-year-old boys that were murdered. But my understanding is the West Memphis Three is actually about the three teenagers who were falsely imprisoned for the death of those three boys. This is one of those where everybody has an opinion about it. Everybody thinks that either the three teenagers did it and they were satanic, cult killing type things, or somebody else did it. And it's just like there's no really in between. So I'm just trying to be objective about it. And especially because now that the Arkansas State Supreme Court has approved DNA testing, there's a really good chance that the MVAC is actually going to be used on some of the evidence. Anyway, enjoy this episode. Enjoy everything that George has to say about this case because he is extremely knowledgeable about it. Hope you guys enjoy.
Hi, my name is George Jared. I'm an investigative journalist and true crime author. I've spent many, many years writing about the West Memphis Three case involving three little boys who died right here in West Memphis back on May 5th, 1993. The boys were playing in this neighborhood behind me, and over here in the distance was a place called Robin Hood Hills. And so their bodies were found in a drainage ditch out there on May 6, 1993. About a month later, three guys, Damian Eccles, Jesse Miskelly Jr., and Jason Baldwin, were arrested for the murders of these three little boys. There's only one little problem. It's almost certain that they didn't do it, and we're here to try to figure out who did. On May 5th, 1993, Pam Hobbs walked down this sidewalk to come pick her son Stevie up from school. The two met. They walked back down this sidewalk back towards the house. They kind of made small talk. He was in the second grade at Weaver Elementary. So when they get to the house, he wants to go out and play with his friend Michael Moore. At first, Pam doesn't want to let him do it, but then eventually she acquiesces. It's a beautiful sunny day. Lots of kids were out in the neighborhood playing. So the two of them leave on their bikes. A short time later, they arrive at Christopher Byers' house. Now, Christopher was in trouble, and so he had to stay home. His parents had grounded him to the yard. When the friends approached, he couldn't control himself, and so he decided to climb onto one of their bikes, and the three boys take off. And so they spent several hours that afternoon roaming these streets. They were seen by many, many people. And around 6:30 that night, those boys vanished out of this neighborhood. So this is the West Memphis neighborhood where Stevie, Christopher, and Michael grew up. We're actually standing at the confluence of Barton and 14th Street. Not sure exactly which houses Stevie and Michael and Christopher lived in, but we know that two of them lived right in this neighborhood. So at 6:30 that night, three women were on their way to church, and they claimed that they saw the three little boys in their yard. They said the three boys came through their yard. One of the girls, she was a teenager. She was friends with Christopher's older brother, Ryan. And she said that she told Christopher that his brother was looking for him and that he needed to go home. And Christopher told her, "You're not my boss and you can't tell me what to do." And then at that moment, the three boys get out of the yard, they go up the street, and at that point, they say that a man, a sandy-haired man, was waving to them and that they were motioned into the house. So this is the pipe, the infamous pipe that you've seen on all the Paradise Lost documentaries, west of Memphis, all the pictures. That's one of the pipes that searchers crossed. As you can see down there, there's still water in that drainage ditch. Yeah, and the drainage ditch goes along for a ways, and then it's going to turn back towards the service road. And along that stretch where it turns back toward the service road is where the three bodies were found. So even though this area was searched the night that the boys vanished, the boys weren't found, their bikes weren't found, their clothes weren't found. One of the reasons is that a lot of these objects were jammed into the mud and into the creek with sticks. And so it would take a while for these things to percolate to the surface. The three boys, depending upon when they were out there, they might have been visible at some point that night. But again, this is as you can see now, there's, trees and bushes. And this is not, we're talking about this happened, the anniversary of when this happened is only 5 days from now. So this is exactly what it looked like. This is exactly what they were dealing with the night that they were looking for those kids. And so if they didn't know exactly where they were along this drainage ditch line, it would be very difficult to find them. And a lot of people don't understand that finding a human body in a body of water can be very, very difficult. On the night of May 5th, 1993, searchers did come out into this area to look for the boys. Now, they had a real bad problem. There was a lot of mosquitoes out, and even the responding officer who was called to this neighborhood when the first two boys were reported missing, even she theorized, she thought to herself when she tried to come out here that the mosquitoes were so bad that there's no way there's three boys there. And so searchers didn't find anything that night, obviously. But then around 1:30 in the afternoon, the next day on May 6th, someone noticed a shoe, looked like a child's shoe, floating in this creek over here. And so Mike Allen, who was a detective at that time, I believe he's became the sheriff here in Crittenden County eventually, he gets into the water, and then this ghostly image comes to the surface, and it's Michael Moore's bound nude body. And not too far from where Michael was found, they found his two companions, Christopher and Stevie. And so at that point, they came in and they drained this drainage ditch, and they started collecting evidence to try to figure out who killed these three kids. So one of the things that we don't understand or we theorize about is how the boys actually ended up down here. Of course, the obvious theory is that they were out here playing and that whoever killed them came upon them out here and did something to them. But there's also alternate theories too. There were three women who lived in this neighborhood who claimed in sworn affidavits that they saw Terry Hobbs motioning the boys into the house around 6:30 that night. So we're trying to figure out exactly if they were killed down here, and if not, where were they attacked, and how did their attacker or attackers get their bodies down here without being seen? So after the boys were discovered in this drainage ditch, not too far from where we're standing, their bodies were taken to the state medical examiner's office, and it was up to the medical examiners to determine how they died. Michael died. He had a contusion to his head, and he drowned in the creek. Stevie had injuries to his face, and he also drowned in the creek. Now, Christopher Byers' autopsy was there was a little bit of, they had to think that one out a little bit more because I don't think they found quite as much water in his lungs as they found in the other two victims. Plus, his organs were reportedly pale when he was found, which means that he had suffered from quite a bit of blood loss. So it's possible that he was very, very much near death whenever he was thrown in here, or maybe actually was already dead when he was thrown into the creek. There are several cases out there though where somebody will drown but not get a lot of water in their lungs. They'll form a mucus pocket in their throat. It happens in about 1 out of every 5 drowning victims. They'll form a mucus pocket, which suffocates them, and it's because of the pressure from the water that's coming into their body. So anyway, that's how they died at this scene. I think there's one detail in this case that people don't focus enough on. It's how the boys were tied. The boys were hog-tied, and what I mean by that is they were tied ankle to wrist with their own shoelaces. Now, the reason it's called hog tying is because it was a popular method used to tie animals in slaughterhouses, back, 60s, 70s, 80s. It was a technique that was used so that they're more easy to move. And I think that people don't focus in on enough the fact that these boys were tied in this specific way, not to drown them, because you don't have to hog tie someone to drown them. All they would have to do is they would have to be bound. If you bound their hands and you bound their feet, you throw them in the creek, eventually they're going to drown. They were hogtied because they had to be moved. And I think it's a very key detail that people don't pay enough attention to. So pretty early on, and by pretty early on, I mean literally as they were pulling the bodies out of this creek over here, detectives started honing in on Damien Echols. And the reason is that there was a guy named Steve Jones. He was like he was like a youth counselor, and he had counseled Damien Echols in the past. And he made a comment to a lot of the law enforcement and the people who were out here searching. When they found the bodies, they said, "Hey," he said, you know, I guarantee you that Damien Echols had something to do with this." And it's odd to me because within 24 hours, they had already done their first interview with Damien Echols at his house. And see, here's the problem with that. Okay. So number one, if, like, let's say you and I are sitting here, I pull out a gun and I shoot you, and these neighbors over here, they see me do it and I run off. I'm a primary suspect because somebody said, "Hey, George just shot Jared," and, you know, he ran off. The second way I could be a primary suspect is they don't see me do it, but they come over here and they find your body and let's say my wallet's laying here, or my gun, something that can be identifiable to me. So that would make me a primary suspect. The third way is I go over to the West Memphis PD and say, "Hey guys, I just shot Jared Bradley. He's out over there by the creek." So in those three circumstances, you could see where you get to a primary suspect within hours. That didn't happen in this case. They didn't have any evidence processed. They didn't have any of this stuff. They didn't have an eyewitness who saw it. They didn't have somebody who came and said, "I did it." They had none of that. So why were they focusing on Damien Echols? Is because they were developing a theory, and they didn't even know, without any information, without any evidence tested, without anything, they developed this theory. And so what they did is, instead of letting the information and evidence lead them to a conclusion, they had a conclusion that was going to try to lead them to evidence, if that makes sense. So we're in Lakeshore. This is the trailer park where Jesse, Jason, and Damien lived. Now, I know what people are going to say, you know, technically, you know, maybe Damien lived in a different trailer park with some family members or something like that, but maybe Jesse did too for some of that time. But this is where they spent most of their time, was the Lakeshore trailer park here. Jason lived here for sure. This is the industrial lake out here where they found that Rambo style knife that they said was used in the attacks on those three boys. There's only, you know, a couple of problems with that Rambo style knife. Number one, I bet you didn't know this. None of the boys had a single stab wound to their bodies. Secondly, one of the injuries that a lot of people keyed in on was the emasculation of Christopher Byers. And so Christopher, his genitals were degloved. Now, defense forensic experts think that he was degloved post-mortem, meaning after he was dead, and they think it was done through animal predation, which makes a lot of sense. However, the state believes that Christopher was emasculated while he was still alive. There's only a couple of problems with that. Number one, even the state's own medical examiner said that the person who did it had to be an old surgeon of some, that they had to have training with a scalpel. Well, the three that were convicted of this crime obviously didn't even have a 10th grade education between them. So there's no way one of them was a doctor and was, you know, using a scalpel. Secondly, can you imagine how the type of injuries that would be present beyond if you were trying to deglove a living, like a child, how he would be squirming and moving and screaming and just all of the things that would be happening if that was actually happening in real life. And you don't see any of those types of injuries. And, you know, all four forensic experts for the defense said it's absolutely inconceivable that these boys would have been, that this Rambo style knife, and I think everybody knows what a Rambo style knife is. It's absolutely inconceivable that these guys would be using this knife and there would not be a single bone piercing injury to the boys. And also, I think it should be noted too that this knife, when it was found months after these guys were arrested. And it was kind of the thought process was, if we don't have a murder weapon, it's going to be hard to convince a jury that, you know, these boys were attacked with a knife, because that's part of Jesse's confession. And so the prosecutor had an epiphany months after the arrest. he thought that the knife might be behind Jason Baldwin's trailer house here in Lakeshore. There was only one problem with that too. He knew there was a knife behind Jason Baldwin's house because one of Jason's friends had gone to the police and said that months and months before the murders, that Jason's mom had found a Rambo-style knife in his room, and she did not want her son carrying a knife, and so she made him go out and throw it into the lake. So he knew it was there because of this story that Jason's friend had already told him, but he never divulged that in the original trials. So in 2020, Bob did that documentary for Oxygen Channel about West Memphis Three, and he actually approached Damien Echols and said, hey, maybe you should consider doing some MVAC DNA testing on some of the evidence in the case. And of course, Damien was, thrilled to do that, or to petition for it. And so they asked the prosecutor at the time, Scott Ellington, hey, would you be agreeable to allowing us to test the ligatures that bound the three boys? Okay. And Scott said that he was agreeable to do the testing. Well, in the interim between the time he agreed to do it and they were going to actually do the testing, Scott became a judge. He was no longer the prosecutor, and so they appointed a guy named Keith Cressman. So several months later, this is after, a lot of the the pandemic restrictions were lifted and people were going back to restaurants and doing stuff like that. And so I went to a Kiwanis Club meeting one day, and Keith Cressman, who was the new prosecutor, he was there, and I went there just to talk to him, chat with him, had a very friendly, cordial conversation. And then toward the end of it, I said, so Damien Echols months ago, or almost a year ago at that point, had petitioned Scott Ellington to do this advanced DNA testing. And, I asked Keith, I said, well, are you going to allow for this to happen? And he said, no. He goes, I'm going to ask a judge to come in and destroy the evidence. And I said, what? And he goes, yeah. He goes, because technically these guys are convicted of second-degree murder, and we only have to keep that kind of evidence in storage for 10 years. And the 10-year anniversary of them being released was coming up. And I said, I understand that's standard procedure in most cases, most murder cases. I said, but do you honestly want to do that in this case with the notoriety, with all the people who know this, know about this case? And he said, yes. And I was like, okay. And so, of course, I wrote a story about it. Of course, it hits the fan, so then, a couple months later, we're a bunch of journalists are, doing FOI requests to try to figure out where this evidence is at. And the first story we got was that the evidence was destroyed in a fire. Well, then some journalists did some FOI requests, and it turns out there hadn't been a fire on any public property in West Memphis, Arkansas in 20 or 25 years. So we knew that was a lie. And then the second thing they came up with was, well, they just lost the evidence. It didn't get burned up in a fire. Well, this went on for months and months and months, them claiming that the evidence was lost. Well, then finally, Damien Echols' attorneys were able to get a judge's order, which ordered, basically his attorneys were going to be able to go into the evidence locker room at the West Memphis Police Department and look at the evidence. They walk in, they see all the evidence neatly stacked or, placed on this table where it had probably been sitting for the last 25 or 30 years at that point. And so 10 minutes after that, guess what? The police chief resigns. So we're across the river now in Memphis. This is the Mississippi River, not far from where those three boys were found. Recently, the Arkansas Supreme Court came down with a ruling, and they're going to allow for touch DNA testing to move forward, which means that they will be using MVAC touch DNA testing to test the ligatures that bound the boys. And why that's important is, think about this. How many people have ever touched your shoelace? Especially when you were a kid. At what point did you stop tying your kids' shoelaces? So what that means is, the answer for most of you is that by the time your kid's 8, you're not tying their shoelaces. So theoretically, the only people's DNA that should be on those shoelaces are the victims and the perpetrator or perpetrators. So testing those shoelaces is critical to figure out who killed these kids. And, and plus, as Jared, Bradley, and I've talked about this several times, shoelaces are a good place to find DNA because they have rough, coarse surface, and that means they're going to pull a lot of skin cells, and some of those skin cells probably could we could expect there to be some level of protection, even if ligatures are in water. And plus, the killer tied knots. So there could be some DNA in those knots that was not affected by the water that the boys were in. So hopefully, within the next month or two, we'll have some real answers as to what happened to those 3 kids. So throughout the course of my journalism career, I've covered literally thousands of stories. And what I can say about the West Memphis Three case is this: it is one of the most unique and infamous cases in U.S. criminal history. There's no question about it. I tell people a lot of times that I think that there are probably 3 cases in the modern era, and I'm talking about individual cases. We're not talking about serial killers and, like terrorism, stuff like that. We're talking about just single event crimes. And I think that O.J. Simpson, the JonBenet Ramsey case, and West Memphis Three are probably at the top of the list. And I may be forgetting about maybe 1 or 2, but for the most part, those are the 3 cases in the modern era that seem to have drawn or attracted the most attention. And, and it's pretty simple. When it comes to West Memphis Three, you have 3 little boys. When it comes to JonBenet Ramsey, you have a little girl. When it came to O.J. Simpson, you had this over-the-top celebrity who no one could fathom could do what he most certainly probably did to his ex-wife and Ron Goldman. So anyway, I can't wait for this MVAC DNA testing to be done. I'm hoping we get results, and I'm hoping we get finality for this case.
Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.